Okay, I welcome all of you who have joined this webinar, and I'm very happy to greet you. My name is Angela KANE, and I'm the Vice President of the International Institute of Peace here in Vienna, and we are organizing this webinar, which is on a very interesting and very important topic, and that is the 1 year after COVID, where are we in diplomacy? And we're organizing this event together with the Peter Ustinov Institute, and it's the first in a series of webinars that we're doing on COVID, because everyone wants to know where are we, how we're going to go into the future, what have we experienced, and how we're going to go forward. So this is something that really, I think, are very much in all of our minds to go on. Now, what we have today is we have two authors with us, and they're very excellent writers. There's a book that is coming out that's on the future of diplomacy after COVID-19. It's actually coming out in about 2 weeks' time. And the two authors who are here with me have both written a chapter in this book. It's a compilation of a number of chapters that were written on various topics, and you'll hear about that in a bit. But the first author we have with us is Andrés FIALLO, who is an Ecuadorian diplomat. And he has been an Ecuadorian diplomat for some 15 years. And he's a delegate to the United Nations in New York. And he's actually joined us from New York. And he's been there since 2019. And also he was there earlier between 2009 and 2015. So he's really, as a diplomat, a very experienced person to talk to us about the multilateralism and also about the UN. He's a former senior political advisor to the President of the United Nations General Assembly, and also a former director for international relations at the Ministry of National Defense of Ecuador. He has a master's degree in diplomacy and international relations from Fairleigh Dickinson University in New York, and a bachelor's in law and political science with a focus on international law from the University of Montpellier in France. And he also studied at the Hague Academy of International Law and the Ecuadorian Diplomatic Academy. And he's written one of the chapters in the book. He'll be the first speaker, but let me also introduce the second speaker, and that is Mona KHALIL, who is a very respected international public lawyer with 25 years of UN and other experience, including as a senior legal officer in the UN Office of the Legal Counsel and also at the IAEA Office of Legal Affairs. And she and I worked as colleagues in the UN, and I was very happy to greet her back here in Vienna when she joined Vienna. She's the director of MAC Law International, which is a strategic consulting service advising governments and NGOs in the service of we the peoples. And she's an affiliate of the Harvard Law School program on international law and armed conflict, and has a BA and an MA from Harvard University, as well as a master's in foreign service and a Juris Doctorate from Georgetown University. So now that I've given you the credentials, I know that you'll be looking forward to hearing from them. And let me tell you a little bit of what we are planning to do. We will have both of them give, or each of them give short introductions, about 5 to 7 minutes, on their chapters in the book. And then we will have a series of questions that I will ask, and I would encourage you to also use the chat function and send us your views, send us your questions, send us your comments, which we'll be happy to incorporate. And I think that both Mr. Diallo and Ms. KHALIL will be very happy to answer questions that are coming from the audience, because that's after all what we want to do. We want to interact with you. We don't want to just be the talking heads here. So again, having said that, let me start with Andrés FIALLO, the Ecuadorian diplomat who has written a chapter in this book called The Future of Diplomacy After COVID-19. So Mr. Diallo, you have the floor, please.
Thank you very much, Ms. Angela KANE. You've been very generous with your introduction and presentation. I am very glad and very honored to join today this audience. Good evening, good afternoon in Vienna, good morning in New York, and hello to everyone that is joining. I'm particularly honored to participate in this discussion with Ms. Angela KANE, especially given your legacy, the legacy you lent to the United Nations in the disarmament affairs during your representation as a high representative of the Secretary General. I'm also very happy to join with my colleague and friend Mona KHALIL. With regard to the book that is coming in precisely in 2 weeks, the perspective on peace and security opened two alternatives. One, that one of possible lost year due to COVID-19, 1 or 2 lost years in terms of efforts, but also a decade in terms of progress. That's one alternative. And the second alternative is that of definitely a leap into a new era of peace and security. Okay, so the book privileged the second alternative, but is obviously something that needs to be written by all states, academia, civil society, in other words, by people, by you and by me. We have focused in the peace and security from the angle of sustaining peace. So there's no peace without development, and there's no development without peace. And in the book, we traveled back to 1918 to unpack the relation between the Spanish flu and peace and security. And it's very interesting to see that the challenges 100 years ago were basically the same. And we need to work hard in order not to have the future that generation had, which was 20 years after the Spanish flu, the Second World War. We really need to work hard to have a different future. Allow me also to thank the Institute, International Institute for Peace, for inviting us to this discussion. We are very excited to see the book coming very soon. You will be able to see in the book a narrative from inside of the UN, how the meetings were postponed, how were we looking at the peace and security in the field being affected, and how were we suffering also from not being able to meet and to deliver, which is the main goal of multilateralism and General Assembly. At some point, and this is also noted in the book, when we had to quarantine in March 2020, some of the colleagues from the Disarmament portfolio were saying, well, we need to ask the city to be classified as essential business. And of course, this was something that was said ironically, and some colleagues reply immediately, this is something the city will not buy. The UN disarmament efforts being as essential service during the pandemic. But at the same time, you had tweeters from US officials saying they haven't lost any capability of launching nuclear weapons anytime during the pandemic. So I hope that the book will contribute not only to the discussions on peace and security, but also especially to the solutions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. FIALLO. That was very interesting. And, I remember Klaus Schwab of the World Economic Forum, he already issued a book last July. Now we were barely 4 months into that, and he didn't look at multilateralism per se, but what he basically sort of said, he said, I mean, this is really amazing because it shows how much we are hyper connected. And he said it actually, he sort of said, is interdependence on steroids. And I think that is a really very important term that we could use, interdependence on steroids. That's really what it's brought down. But when you talk about how it's affected the work of the United Nations, I think you're also looking at not only New York headquarters, but you're also looking at the field. So how would you say that COVID-19 and the pandemic and the closures and the lockdown and the isolation, how has it affected the field operations?
Yes, thank you for your question. So indeed, COVID-19 has affected peace and security not only in the UN by pulverizing meetings that were prepared and that are often bureaucratic but needed. But in the field, it has affected directly the peacekeeping operations. It has affected the access to humanitarian assistance, humanitarian aid in zone of conflict. It has affected the population. It has deteriorated the living conditions of population in conflict, but also of population out of conflict. So the Secretary General has mentioned several times that the pandemic is actually affecting countries that are being considered traditionally as stable countries. The pandemic in the field has disrupted the justice service, which affects particularly to women and girls. Domestic violence has rise. You have kids out of the schools due to the digital divide. 1 out of 4 young person is living in a conflict zone. Basically, this is an opportunity unfortunately, for the violent extremists to recruit and to benefit from the exacerbation of the situation around the world.
That's very true, and I think you're pointing to very worrying developments that have taken place over the last year, and that are clearly not going to go away very quickly once the restrictions are lifted, but they will be with us for a while. But the question that I have to you as a follow-up is, what can we do to improve the situation for the future? What can we do to be future ready after COVID-19?
Yes, well, that's actually a question that we're trying to answer in the book. You mentioned that in the book there are so many chapters, and actually there are: future on economics, future on development, future on health, the future of multilateralism, future of digital cooperation, and the future of peace and security is nothing more than all those future being prosperous. So in order to be future ready, we need to expend less in arms and more in vaccines. I was looking at I think the Twitter of the ambassador from Costa Rica this morning. No weapon can be as strong as a vaccine today, and I think we need to work for that, for a stronger United Nations, a stronger multilateralism, a stronger engagement with multiple stakeholders, with academia. We need to stop having the agenda on women, peace and security as a photo opportunity, and we really need to implement it all over the world, in all the countries. We need to work basically in all the different aspects to be ready. If you look at the budget expended in 2019 by 9 countries in nuclear weapons, with that budget you can finance 30 years of operation of the World Health Organization. So it's not that we don't have the resources, we have the resources, but we just need to prioritize. To be future ready, we also need to put pressure through democratic means in our own governments, in our organizations. The COVID-19 pandemic basically obliged us to prioritize and to go from the generalities to the specificities, to work on a better health. You know that Ms. Kane, in 15 years ago, the United Nations was already working on addressing the possibility of a pandemic through the panel on threats and challenge and change created by Kofi Annan. And however, 15 years after that panel and the recommendations that were very substantive, we were not ready. In the recommendations, they were going to specific aspects such as what should be the relation between the Security Council and the Director General of the WHO. It was supposed to be a very close relation, but 15 years after that report, we had the COVID-19, and the Security Council failed to adopt quickly a resolution to join the global efforts against the COVID-19. It was only able to adopt the resolution 2532 4 months after the pandemic.
Thank you for mentioning two of the topics that actually I wanted to raise with you as well. And that was, first of all, your analysis of disarmament and arms control, which you speak about in the chapter. And that's very important. And now we've just, and I think this is what the Costa Rican ambassador also referred to in her tweet, that was the latest figures that are coming out from SIPRI, the Swedish Research Institute, and they're always giving very good overviews. And if any of you want to have a look at that, you can go on the website and see that. But what it actually shows is that despite a drop in the economic development of all countries, the increase in military expenditures have increased. And the question is, of course, how sensible is that in a time when we need all of our efforts to combat the virus, and we need vaccines, in which we need support for those who are suffering economically also from this downturn, who may have gotten unemployed, etc. There are many, many needs of the population, and therefore to spend that much money on armaments, buying arms, fighting conflict is, of course, something that's very worrying. And I also like the fact that you bring up the high-level panel on threats, challenges, and change. And you're right. I mean, it's been 15 years. And actually, when you look at that, and we forget that, it kind of, we see it, and then it's very exciting, and then it goes in a drawer, and then we don't unearth it. So I'm very happy that you actually brought it up, because 15 years ago, it was actually had a lot of foresight. But of course, people forgot that, they basically shoved it aside. And I remember that I was working on the Ebola and also the H1N1, the so-called flu epidemic, which took place around that time, a little earlier. And again, those plans that we elaborated then were rather quickly forgotten. So I'm very glad. I have one last question to you, though, which I found absolutely fascinating. And you had basically spoken about the Security Council, and I remember that you mentioned an issue of reform, which Ecuador actually proposed and raised in the consultations. And that was really about the shape and the equipment of the Security Council chamber. That was really striking to me, because even though yes, I mean, here we're in the COVID situation, but I do think that I'd like you to share that with the audience, to sort of hear what actually you thought would be good to implement in terms of the Security Council shape and form.
Thank you for that question. Is very interesting also, and I invite all the audience to really read the book. There's a very nice details from inside the UN, the methods, the negotiations, the physical installation infrastructure. So with regard to the Security Council, one of the most prominent process in the United Nations today, and for many years and decades actually, is the question of the reform of the Security Council. We're trying to have a Security Council more open, transparent, with methods of work more efficient. And when you look at the room in the chamber of the Security Council, you don't have you have a strong division physically between the semicircle where the 15 members sit, the 5 permanent members and the 10 non-permanent members, and they have their table, the microphone, and you have accessibility even for persons with disability to that segment. But the rest of the membership, the non-members of the council that are members of the United Nations, they are sort of sitting like in a tribune in sort of like the grand stadium, like spectators looking at what's going on in the council. And you don't have a microphone, you don't have a table. Now it looks simply logistical, but it's not, because with the ECOSOC, Economic and Social Council of the United Nations, also not every country is member to it. We are all observers, but you elect 54 countries every year to serve in the Economic and Social Council, and their chamber is more or less equipped the same for everyone. Every country has the possibility to take the microphone and speak, and this is very interesting because 10 years ago, we went under the Capital Master Plan. We did work we invest money to change the room of the Security Council, but these divisions are still there. And going from the symbolic to the ground, in March, when we were quarantined, the Security Council continued working through video, and in 4 months later, they went back to the chamber. But with the countries that are not members to the council, we were not able to intervene with our statements in the debates, in the open debate. So the open debate, the so-called open debates, they only allow you now during the pandemic to intervene with a written statement. So, and the written statement is very important, but is not really been read by the members of the council before their debate. So when you look at, I mentioned before, Resolution 2532 and the fact that they took 4 months to adopt the resolution, the resolution was adopted only 7 days after 172 countries that do not serve in the council joined together with a strong declaration in support of the call of the SG for the global ceasefire. And we put pressure on the council, and 7 days later, finally the resolution was adopted. So when you see, for example, civil society also haven't had that much access to the council, when even member states, we don't have that access, and this is something that needs to be improved, even from the mental, from the imagination we have about the council. And that will start with changing the form and the format of the room.
I think this is a fascinating story. It really is. And of course, with the reform of the Security Council discussions, which has gone on for over 20 years, I think. Yes. But it is a very important point, because not only is it that the members who are not members of the Security Council are prevented from speaking, but also when it comes to talking to and maybe giving some ideas or suggestions to the members of the council, you can't do that, if it's like an exclusive session with only the 15 members, because, you're outside of that circle. So I think this is a very good point. And I will share with you that when I was Under Secretary General for Management and I was in charge of the Security Council for all of the change and upgrading of the what we call the UN campus, I actually talked to the Secretary General of making some changes, not that particular change that you mentioned, but also to accommodate possible larger number of members. And he basically was horrified, because he said, let's not touch this, because this is very politically sensitive, which of course it is. But I wanted to allow for the possibility that, yes, there would be seats added to it. But on the other hand, it was just left as it was, because that was the safe bet. Now, let me mention one chat that I have gotten, or that we have gotten, and that comes from Ambassador Tenner, who is a Swiss ambassador, who actually is on the advisory board of the IIP, and I'm happy that he's joined. And he's come back to the CIPRI global military expenditures, and he said, according to CIPRI, the 2020 expenditures are 2.6% higher than in 2019. So that is considering the large figure that it already is. It's a huge amount of money that was added in 2020. Anyway, thank you very much, Mr. FIALLO. We are going to come back to you in a bit when we have more questions, and I would encourage the audience to please give us your questions or comments. We appreciate that. And I'd now like to turn to Mona KHALIL, who has written another chapter. She's written actually as kind of a summary chapter in the book, looking at the whole viewpoint of the previous chapters that were written. And I'm asking her to please introduce the work that you have done on this. Ms. KHALIL, please.
Thank you, Angela. And thanks, of course, to the International Institute for Peace and the Sir Peter Ustinov Institute for inviting us, and you for moderating our event today. It's a great honor to be with you on the screen again. I also want to thank our co-authors, who should not go unmentioned: Han Al-Hashimi of the UAE, Tony Shea Freckleton of Jamaica, Fat Hulachela of Indonesia, and Jonathan Vieira of Ecuador. Together with Andres and myself, we were proud to come together at this critical juncture, both in the history of the UN, but also in the history of mankind, on assessing what the impact of COVID-19, both the negative and the positive, will have on international diplomacy and multilateralism. I was very honored when they invited me to write the concluding chapter, and from that moment, I understood my task to be threefold. First, as you noted, to bring together the conclusions of the other chapters and how my fellow authors have dealt with the impact, assessed the impact, and identified the future, each in their own field, from public health to sustainable development, economics and financing, digital cooperation, Andreas with peace and security, as you just mentioned, and in my case, moving on to address the impact on human rights and the rule of international law. And I kind of used the framework of the declaration commemorating the 75th anniversary of the United Nations, both as a method to harness the watershed event, but also as a framework in terms of how we assess progress in the future, as we not even sustain, but maybe even restore and resurrect, if I may use the word, the United Nations from what has been a seeming deterioration in the past several decades. The second was, of course, to identify the opportunities and challenges that the pandemic posed and the lessons learned in order to strengthen the ability of the principal organs in fulfilling the vision of the Charter and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And last but not least, using the rule of law and the Charter as a way to restore the credibility and the effectiveness of the UN. So looking backwards, we can look back at the 1918 pandemic and the immediate aftermath. But I chose to look back at the World War II kind of evolution of human interaction. We had people like Winston Churchill, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, Joseph Stalin, and Chiang Kai-shek, none of whom can be painted historically as dreamers or optimists, naive idealists or pacifists. They had come together, enemies at one point, but come together to defeat Hitler and the Nazi war machine, to conspire to compel Hirohito's surrender in the East, with or without the additional horrors of the US bombings, atomic bombings in Nagasaki and Hiroshima. And yet, even before the war had ended, they were meeting to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war, to reaffirm faith in the fundamental human rights for all, to promote the rule of law and justice, and to promote social progress and better standards of life and larger freedom. They did not do this out of a sense of poetry or philosophy. They did it out of sense of survival. Having learned the lessons of World War II and the Holocaust, they adopted the Charter to offer a way out of war and towards peace and security, an end to genocide and a path to peace, sustainable development, and human rights for all. And yet, in the last couple of decades, we seem to have moved away from these hard-won lessons. We seem to have forgotten how hard it is to ignore the simple equality and integrity and dignity of a human being. We have seen a return to blatant power politics and a move away from the ideals and the values that have sustained a world without a world war for the last 75 years. So we see the permanent five, who are meant to be the guardians of the Charter, becoming the violators. And it was in this environment that we entered the pandemic. And that dysfunctionality that was born out of this very, not just national interested P5, but very narrowly nationally interested P5, in particular, the Americans, Chinese, and Russians at the time, that dysfunctionality really handicapped the initial efforts to respond to the pandemic. And we saw very petty, almost, fighting between the Trump administration and the Chinese regarding even how to refer to the virus in international parley. And as a result, whereas the General Assembly was able to adopt a very robust resolution within a matter of days, it took the Security Council 4 months to arrive at a coherent response to the pandemic. So what we see in the 75th anniversary declaration is an actual recognition that we have to do better. Not only do better as an institution, but we have to build back better. It's not enough to go back to the status quo ante. It's not enough to get rid of the pandemic. We need to also address the socio-economic impact, the many fissures that were exposed, not just caused, but exposed by the pandemic, not just to restore the health of men and women, but also the health of the planet, not just to restore the status quo, but to actually live up to the promise and vision of the Charter and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So in my chapter, I talk about what it would take for the Security Council, the General Assembly, and the Secretariat to do just that, to build back better, to come back better than we had when we started the pandemic in March 2020. To not only be able to meet, but to also act and take effective decisions, whether it's a pandemic, whether it's a natural disaster, as we saw with Hurricane Sandy, whether it's a terrorist event, as we saw in 9/11, whether it's war, whether it's other threats to international peace and security. the need for the Council to act promptly and effectively, to mobilize the Council to live up to its responsibility. It's not just a discretion, but an actual responsibility to respond and to prevent threats to peace and security. The General Assembly waking up and fulfilling its secondary residual role, either through special sessions or emergency special sessions, and the Secretary General acting under Article 99 to point out where the Council has failed and to give recommendations to ensure that they can act promptly and effectively. So I'd like to conclude with a quote from Dag Hammarskjöld, who once said that the UN was created not so much to bring us to heaven, but rather to save us from hell. And in so doing, the United Nations must now work at this very pivotal moment to ensure that equally and with respect for the dignity of all, that we can come together to solve the common challenges, including ensuring vaccines for the entire planet, so that in the self-interest of all, so that we don't continue to have new variants, so that we don't continue to struggle with surges and resurges. Thank you. I've used up my 7 minutes now.
Thank you very much, Ms. KHALIL. No, that was very interesting. It was kind of a whole gamut of things that were happening. And what struck me particularly, we're talking a lot about what went wrong, and also what we're now seeing went wrong. I think that none of us were really quite as focused on saying it out loud. You know, this isn't working, that isn't working, and we need to make improvements. But you come up with the idea or with the thought that, you know, really the 20th century or the 20th century was just a terrible century, you know, starting with the Spanish flu, which also Mr. FIALLO already mentioned. Then we had 2 world wars. We had, you know, atomic bombs thrown over Hiroshima, Nagasaki, etc. So the question that I have is, here we are for over a year already in COVID. Is the 21st century actually going to be better?
We certainly hope so, and we certainly will work towards, as my colleague Andres said, to do better in terms of the aftermath of the pandemic. You know, we had the 1920s, which everybody sees as the big kind of party where, you know, Hollywood and all of the big flapper parties and everything. But that isn't the legacy of the 20th century. It is, in fact, 2 world wars. It is, in fact, multiple genocides, including the Holocaust. It is, in fact, untold numbers of millions of people slaughtered in war and in genocide, including the 50 million who died in the pandemic. So far, we've had 3 million, which is 3 million too many, obviously, but it pales in comparison to the 50 million that died in the 1918, 1919 pandemic. Imagine, you know, they had to do the same thing: mask, social distance, lockdown, quarantine, but they did it without their devices. They did it without the Zoom calls. They did it without the ability to communicate with their families in different parts of the world. They did it without Netflix. They did it without all of the things that have kept us sane in this very, very insane set of circumstances that we've survived in the last 16 months. And despite all of that, none of that kind of epiphany, philosophical awakening happened. That awakening happened after World War II. It didn't happen after the pandemic. So hopefully we're smarter and we take advantage of this pandemic and know that it can be a natural disaster with the acceleration of climate change that, again, sends us into Zoom mode or remote mode. It can be, heaven forbid, another war. It could be another terrorist attack. We have to be ready. We have to be able not just to meet, not just to see each other across the screen, but to actually effectively make decisions, to, in a way, use the technology, as we have seen, to come together, not just the members, but those who are affected by these crises, whether it's war or terrorism or genocide or climate change or pandemic. We need to hear by those most affected. They will have answers for us that we, sitting in the comfort of our homes and in the comfort of our UN chambers, will not know. And that applies also to solving conflict. Those who have understood the root causes of conflict, those who have experienced conflict, those who have seen sexual violence and rape as a weapon of war, and those who have seen the genocide in action, have answers on how to prevent that, on how to ensure justice and criminal accountability that we should hear from, both as a General Assembly and as a Security Council. So this promise to be more inclusive must be manifested in real terms, and I think the technology available to us makes that ever more possible. But we don't have such a happy beginning. We have 9/11 in this century. We have 20-year war in Afghanistan, we have the US aggression in Iraq, we have the Russian aggression in Ukraine, we have genocides in Darfur and Myanmar, and possibly now also with the Uyghur people. We've seen the terror of Al-Qaeda, we've seen the barbarity of ISIS. So this, coupled with the climate change and the COVID-19 pandemic, does not bode well. But it's up to us to come together, as member states have promised to do in the UN 75 Declaration, and be inspired by our universal values that we have accepted, and be inspired by the roles and responsibilities that we've undertaken in the Charter. These are things that exist. All we need to do is tap them and make them more than words on paper.
Thank you very much, Ms. KHALIL. That's in a way, it's also encouraging because you're talking about the positive influence of what, for example, we can do now because of technology. And I think that's something that we often overlook because all of us are talking, we have too many Zooms. We're sitting the whole time in front of the computer, you know, I mean, we actually don't talk to people. And there is a certain energy that also is transmitted if you are in a room with people, if you can discuss, if you can negotiate, or, you know, if you can just say a nice word or so say, how are you? How is your family? And I think we're all missing that.
Right.
But you have worked for many years in the United Nations. And so, you know, you're an expert on the organization. So how do you think it is going to affect the UN staff, the interaction between the diplomats and the UN staff? And maybe Mr. FIALLO can come in on that as well, because I think this is something that it's totally missing. I saw, again, Mr. FIALLO mentioned a tweet earlier, and I saw a tweet today, which was actually the Committee on Information at the UN actually met in person. And this is like the big event of, you know, the month or the year or whatever. And this is really very unusual. And there was a lot of pressure there to be done. So how do you see that, knowing the building as well as you know, and as well as, you know, what's going on, you know, and the day-to-day work there?
I mean, I think it's been a wake-up call on so many levels, both in terms of the functionality, the logistics of having to meet under crisis circumstances. And I think we've discovered that we have those needs. And it was a little bit of an adjustment at the beginning, but in relatively short order, the Secretariat, I think, did well in providing the platforms and providing the frameworks. There are questions that linger, and they are legitimate questions, albeit sometimes exaggerated, things about deep fake and, you know, hacked meetings and hacked voting systems. But they were able eventually to develop, you know, written methods of voting. They should be able, you know, with all of the protections that are available, to do remote voting, you know, virtual voting in due course. And I understand that there are legitimate concerns, but those can be overcome. One interesting thing, and it's kind of sad to bring this up, but I think it's necessary to bring it up. You've seen a very, very stark reduction in cases of sexual harassment and cases of workplace misconduct and abuse of authority. Because people are not in the office, obviously the opportunity to commit such misconduct is lesser. So while we see that domestic violence and sexual violence and violations of international humanitarian law are on the rise because of the the inability to monitor as we do normally, the working from home has one kind of salubrious effect, which is that the normal level of sexual harassment and workplace misconduct has gone down. We also have a lighter environmental footprint. We don't have all of the costs and the travel and the various environmental impacts that we have with these. Nobody convenes a meeting like the UN, but as a result, it's lightened that footprint, and that's a positive thing. And we've seen how much we can do virtually. Now, we shouldn't do everything virtually because, as you said, the level of trust, the level of confidence that is born out of a human contact cannot be replaced by a television screen or by a computer screen. That's both in staff as well as amongst the diplomats, but also between them, as you rightly noted. So we need to maximize the ability to reach those that we wouldn't otherwise reach, because we've now discovered the virtues of remote technology, but we shouldn't rely on it too excessively, and still rely on the permanent missions, still rely on the fact that we come together to build human relations, because that's ultimately the forum that the UN provides.
Thank you very much. And maybe I can turn to Mr. FIALLO, if you could also talk about how it's affected your work from a diplomatic side in the interactions with the UN.
Thank you very much, Ms. Angela KANE. Actually, you have touched on something that Ecuador is very proud of, because precisely yesterday, my ambassador was elected as the chair of the Committee on Information. And I can tell you that he was very happy to be able to hold the meeting in the headquarters. And he has been leading efforts together with other ambassadors to bring more and more of the processes and the meetings in the headquarters. I think he quantified and he agrees and he supports also the President of the General Assembly willingness to keep returning more and more to the headquarters. So I see definitely we need to reduce digital divide, because also the capacities that every mission has with regard to the other is not necessarily the same. So some missions of the 193 member states are better equipped than others. And that's why in the book we're mentioning the need to equip the UN, the General Assembly, the different organs, but also the missions in an equal level. Digital technologies are a great opportunity to overcome the challenges posed by the pandemic, but yet they will not replace the in-person and the contact-to-contact that is always very substantive. And you know better than me, Ms. Angela Kane, how in the UN corridors are also very important, and the coffee and the chat diplomacy. So we are looking forward to an improvement in this great host city, which is New York, in the UN headquarters. But there are some challenges still to be back totally, and this is also affecting could be affecting the conference, the review conference of the Treaty on Non-Proliferation, because some states, including Ecuador, were calling for a full-fledged meeting with all the organs and subsidiary bodies in the UN, with no restriction to delegates, to the number of delegates, and other delegations prefer to keep it more in a hybrid or virtual format. Meanwhile, countries continue spending so much money in an obscene way, to paraphrase the expressions from Ambassador of Austria in the UN in the midst of a pandemic.
Thank you very much. That's that's very, very important. And I think it's not only the interaction, of course, amongst the diplomats in New York, but the big question comes, like we had last year, and all of the meetings that are being organized for the General Assembly, when people are coming from other countries, that's basically when really the difficulty comes, is will the United States allow them all in, even though they're required to under the headquarters agreement. But the headquarters agreement never foresaw a COVID situation where people would be afraid that opening their borders would actually bring in, more mutations or diseases or whatever. And that is something that we also have to take into account. And the other issue that I find very difficult also, and you mentioned this already in New York, about the lack of access of certain missions that are not as well equipped electronically as some others. How about the capitals? How about the capitals in some countries? That's, again, it's a very important issue. Sometimes the connections are unstable. So, you drop out, it falls away. So I think we've all experienced this, and it just needs to be looked at how we can. Now, I have questions coming in, and let me just turn to the first one, which came in, and that basically was the question that focused on the situation with vaccination geopolitics. And what is the role of the US, the EU, China, and Russia? And what does it really mean for multilateralism and diplomacy? I mean, does it have an impact? Maybe I can turn to you first, Ms. KHALIL.
Yes, indeed. There is, I would say, the reality, and there's the in a sense, the what is and the what should be. We do, in fairness, see Russia and China giving millions of jabs, or whatever we call them, vaccinations to needy countries, whether Africa, Asia, throughout the world. The US is now beginning to promise to do the same. We have President Biden talking about using the excess, primarily AstraZeneca. I think one can read many things into that, being distributed, millions of doses being shared with the world community. The EU has struggled with its own rollout, and I think as it's now beginning to do better, it may itself fulfill a long-standing legacy of being one of the most humanitarian and most committed to the development of others. None of this is a question of charity, and none of it is a question of good deeds. It's really self-interest, because the sooner we stem the pandemic, the sooner we stop new variants from growing, the sooner we stop new resurgences, the sooner we stop re-emergence of spread between countries. As long as we're so interdependent, as long as international travel is open, the ability to resurge is always there. So it's really a matter of self-interest. So I'd like to imagine, as I do in the chapter, where there is a coherent General Assembly that can adopt a not necessarily binding, but at least a recommended strategic plan that everybody signs up to. A Security Council that is in a position, as we did with the Ebola mission. You mentioned the Ebola mission, where there was a coming together, and it wasn't until the international community came together that there was an effective response. That we have possibly a basic income, a universal basic income adopted by the General Assembly that can help alleviate the socio-economic impact of the pandemic. That we have a Security Council that is willing to come together and rise above the narrow national interests of its members, in particular the permanent 5 members, to put in place some kind of mechanism by which all who have been responsible for the primary spread of the disease and can come together to prevent the further spread and reintroduction of new variants. And last but not least, where there is a mechanism in place to ensure, consistent with WHO recommendations, that the vaccine is available to everybody at hopefully free, but if not free, at least at the most affordable and most supported price, so that we can return to normal, restore economics, restore politics, restore security.
Thank you very much, Ms. KHALIL. May I turn to you, Mr. FIALLO?
Thank you very much. And that's actually a very good question. I will start by recalling the message from the Secretary General of the United Nations. This pandemic has provided a wake-up call. And also I want to remind a joint declaration of a few head of state and government, including the Ecuadorian head of state, where they call not to avoid falling in the game of geopolitics with regard to the pandemic and the vaccines. However, this is obviously a reality in general, I will say. This is also very detailed in the book. But I can say also that there are some efforts undergoing in the United Nations, very important efforts. On the 27th of February, we just adopted a resolution proposed by United Kingdom and co-sponsored by many countries, including Ecuador, in the Security Council, on the access to vaccine in conflict zones. So that's a first important element. On the other hand, I think at this stage, we just need to make sure to support the efforts from every country to access vaccines, and to the countries that produce them to distribute the vaccines. Ecuador actually is very thankful with all the countries that are producing vaccines. And we hope that also we go towards a more equitable world order. It's not correct and normal that, for example, I got my 2 doses of vaccines, and my young colleagues and friends, they have those. They access the vaccine here in New York. But for example, my parents who live in a developing country, and they are more than 70 years old with specific health conditions, they don't have their access yet. So I think we need to think about this, to really, as Mona Khalil said, to rebuild better, to go to a more equitable war, and to look at the distribution also to least developed countries that haven't even received one single doses of the vaccine, which is unacceptable.
Thank you very much. And I think there are projections about how long it would take if the vaccination rates don't speed up, i.e. it could take several years before the world is vaccinated. And until the world is vaccinated, you will have that virus that's going to be with us. And even when everyone is vaccinated, I think what is now foreseen is that there will be multiple doses that one needs. You know, the protection only lasts for so long. So I think this is really the foremost challenge of our time, of our era. How do we actually deal with this? I think this was a very interesting exchange that we had. I want to come to another question that has come in, and it's by Stéphane Vazel, who clearly is an international civil servant. He says he's worked in various regional organizations in his UN capacity with EU, AU, NATO, League of Arab States, and the OIC, and now with the OSCE. But he says he's a bit perplexed, considering because of the complexity, because of the centrality of some of the issues which come under its purview under a global perspective, and also the current state of play. But particularly he mentions the failure to have a ministerial declaration on COVID last September. And he would like to hear the views, in particularly with the angle regarding multilateralism, about the UN and the regional organizations. And is there the possibility to envisage a truly effective mechanism with a profound reorganization, which would also include the reconsolidation of the primacy of the UN security, reformed as required, as he says, in the maintenance of peace and security? It's a bit of a long question, but I think it's a very good question. So let me turn this over again, and I'm going to stick with the order I have. So please, Ms. Khalil, if I could turn it over to you.
Yes, thank you, Stefan, for an excellent question, and that really is the crux of the matter. Because if the entity that is entrusted with the fulfillment of the highest of the goals of the organization, which is implementation of all the other goals and enforcement of all the other goals, is not intact, is not functioning, then the ability of the rest of the organization to live up to its promise is called into question. So indeed, the failures of the Council have been many and have preceded the pandemic. We all are counting on the fact that the same way World War II was kind of a wake-up call to how ugly mankind can be to itself, that the pandemic has not only caused, but has exposed so much of the dysfunctionality of the Council and of the relationships between its permanent members. Some optimism, of course, comes in with the change in government in the United States, a government that is more dedicated to the rule of law, that is more interested in multilateralism, that is more respectful of the added value of allies and the added value of multilateral institutions that there can be. But no one country can face these common challenges alone. No one country can turn the ship of humanity back onto a more worthy track. So we need all of them to take their responsibilities seriously, to fulfill their responsibilities seriously, to stop abusing, and I say abusing rather conscientiously, abusing the veto and the threat of the veto. There are certain things that shock the conscience of mankind that cannot be subject to a veto. Granted, that's the political right, that's the legal right to use it, but there are other legal obligations. The veto is not the end-all and be-all of the legal framework of the world. It's one legal aspect of the legal framework and the international framework. It cannot become the end-all and be-all of the architecture. There are other equally important aspects, the customary international principles against genocide, against torture, against the serious violations of humanitarian law and human rights law. These two must have weight. These two must be respected. And the Council's primary raison d'etre is to prevent these violations from occurring. not just to stop them once they occur, but to actually prevent them. And we need to hold the P5 and the Council accountable for their own success and failure in living up to their mandate. And that there should be at least a political price when they don't. There needs to be some kind of measurement of their progress, and then they too measuring the progress of their mandates. Have their resolutions borne fruit? Have their resolutions fulfilled the stated objectives? Have the peacekeeping missions? Have the sanctions regimes? All of the architecture that is in place. It can't just be resolutions that are adopted. There needs to be resolutions that are implemented, missions that are fulfilled, wars that are ended, genocides that are stopped, perpetrators that are held accountable. All of that is a measurement of the success. And again, it's not a prerogative, it's not a discretion. Article 24 of the Charter clearly states a responsibility to provide prompt and effective action to prevent threats and restore international peace and security. So I think it's possible. I think even in the worst parts of the pandemic, we have seen progress on multiple fronts, including most recently in Libya. There seems to be some movement towards a sort of, I don't want to call it a reconciliation, but maybe a détente in Yemen. So progress is possible. If it's possible during the worst times, then it's certainly possible post-pandemic.
Thank you very much, Ms. KHALIL. And I think you put a very important spotlight on it. It's not only the maintenance of international peace and security, but also the prevention, which is really, really important. And what I particularly like to see, I think there's a lot more transparency now as to what's happening in the Security Council. What are the debates like? I remember when I first joined the UN, you didn't even have a agenda that was published. So one didn't even know what was discussed in informal consultations. So I think that there's a lot more scrutiny and there's a lot more criticism and possibly also encouragement of the elected members to take a more active role. I'm going to give you, Mr. FIALLO, the floor, please, if you would comment as well on this. And then I have a question that is particularly addressed to you. So stay tuned after you have intervened.
Thank you very much. Not much to add. I think the response by Mona KHALIL has been very comprehensive. I'll only add to that the need to support and engage in support of the Secretary General Antonio Guterres efforts to switch towards a preventive approach, a preventive diplomacy, to implement the peace building architecture review that was adopted in December. So I think I'll only add to that. And there are a lot of challenges, but I can tell you also, coming from a developing country, that we also see in the field the UN working. Without the UN efforts, the COVID-19 pandemic will have even affected tremendously more than that it has already done.
That's very encouraging. Thank you. Thank you for that. As a former UN staffer, I'm very pleased to hear that the UN continues to do good work. I have now a very specific question, as I mentioned, that goes to you, and that comes from Nevzat Ödivoglu. And the person is asking, in the UN, what kind of coffee chats do you have? Are they like daily chats or at a level of UN Congress formality? And how does it affect your formal contacts? I think people don't quite know how it works, so it would be good to have a little bit more detail or explanation of it. Mr. FIALLO, please.
Thank you. Yes, so in the United Nations, as I think in any other organization or even civil company, we have our procedures, we have our negotiations, we have our chats, and basically it's just in an informal way, but is needed to achieve our goals and our objectives and landmarks. And we have switched this to actually digital chats, to the digital platforms such as WhatsApp. It's very interesting because before the pandemic, you will never have asked a colleague or from another country, how are you voting through chat, or providing a recommendation, or even asking to change a sentence, or to support you in a negotiation through WhatsApp, it would have been more rare to do so. But because you had the opportunity to go out of the negotiation room and ask the support and convince, etc. So I don't know if I'm answered that question, but it's just in the informal level. But I think it's the more important, because everything is done between human beings, and digital platforms are very needed. But again, it will not replace the person-to-person diplomacy.
Right. Thank you. Thank you very much for that explanation. I think that's very true. Now, I have another question here, and that's from Ambassador Tenner, who, as I mentioned to you, is in Switzerland, and he is a member of our IIP advisory board. And he was asking, how would you assess the impact of COVID-19 on UN political and peacekeeping missions? And of course, there are a fair number of people who are in both political and peacekeeping missions. And you have the duty of care issues, you have repatriation of staff, you have limited mobility in the host country because the host country may also be in lockdown. And how can the mission mandates still be implemented? Clearly, there's a challenge here. I mean, how does the UN actually cope with that? I don't know, Ms. KHALIL, if you can answer that, or...
Sure.
Yeah.
Indeed, yeah, the impact has been profound. I remain in the camp that cheers that they carry on their mandates. Despite all of the odds, they have been able to carry on their mandates, obviously to a degree less than they would without the COVID-19 pandemic. By the same token, I think we need to salute them for continuing to deliver on mandates that are difficult even in the best of times, maintaining supposedly peace where peace does not exist, and add on top of that, the pandemics that have constrained their ability to reach the primary beneficiaries, which are the populations, as well as the governments who are their partners, and in some cases, their adversaries in delivering on those mandates. So first, let me pay tribute to all the peacekeepers, civilian, police, and military who are performing under the even worse circumstances than usual. Add to that we had, at least initially, a freeze on the rotation. So you had, in order to prevent, the virus from entering countries from abroad, or of sending viruses back to the states of nationality of the various police as well as military contingents, the rotations were suspended for some time. And then questions of mental health, of course, emerged, because you have people performing serious conflict functions in very, very unstable and hostile environments, and yet unable to benefit from their regular rotations. This, to a certain degree, applies to the R&R of the civilian staff as well. The inability to rotate out created a very, I would say, necessary component of the well-being of the staff themselves, of the contingents themselves, and the need to address that mental health component, I think, was very visible. How well, I'm not in a position to judge how well the organization did in actually addressing it, but I am aware that the need to address it was recognized. The governments, of course, their priorities shifted to, almost existential crisis mode, while at the same time relying on the UN and on the, broad network of intergovernmental organizations, both of the UN as well as the non-governmental architecture that is available. Those were the ones who are willing to stay operational on the ground and are the true heroes of the moment, not only to identify and monitor violations, but also to identify need and to identify mechanisms by which to assess the spread of the virus, as well as the ability to provide treatment and now provide vaccination. So I think there has to be a real reckoning of the organization's dependence and reliance on these networks of local and international NGOs that do the heavy lifting on the ground in the fulfillment of these mandates. So while we pay tribute to the UN actors, we must also pay tribute to the non-UN actors who have allowed the UN to continue to perform, to deliver under these very austere circumstances.
Thank you. And I think it's becoming increasingly even more clear than it was before that we're all in this together. It's not depends on one organization. It does not depend on a NGO. It does not depend on a multilateral organization unless we really pull our weight all together. It's just not going to, it's just not going to work. It's not going to be possible to continue the work that we actually have been doing. And that is a joint effort, obviously. Mr. FIALLO, can I turn to you now, please?
Thank you, Ms. Kane. So also this is a very important question, and is also underlying the value of digital technologies and of adaptability. So in March, when we went to quarantine, the question was there: how can peacekeeping operations continue without mandate for those that were expiring already and that were going to expire in the following weeks and months? So there was no question to stop the work of the Security Council, and the Security Council was able to very quickly adapt with the provisional procedures to adopt resolutions in an electronic manner. So this is very important. This is actually commendable, because there was no wait or delay in adopting renewing the mandates where they needed to be renewed. And also the fifth committee, the committee in charge of finance and budget in the United Nations, those that provide the budget for the operations to continue, also was the first committee, the main committee of the General Assembly, that work through digital means in order to keep the machinery working. So that is very important. An additional thing that I think it's also commendable. I've been pretty critical of the Security Council at the beginning of my interventions, but I also need to recognize important elements when those elements happen, and is that there is a trend that in most of the resolutions, they include not only for the safety and protection of the peacekeepers, but also they include a line, a dispositive, asking the operations to support the local efforts in the combat against COVID-19. So this is also very important. I think the UN had managed with the success to avoid having the peacekeeping operations as spreaders of the virus, like it could have happened 100 years ago with the military's deployment of the First World War. But in this case, actually, the peacekeepers are doing a magnificent effort in helping local communities as much as they can to combat the pandemic. And once again, there's no there's no better option than the implementation of the global call for ceasefire by the Secretary General.
That's actually very encouraging. Thank you for mentioning also the good parts of what this brought about. I have now another question that comes, and that goes back to our discussion, particularly on the Security Council. And I'm looking at Ms. KHALIL here, and I'm looking at both of you, actually, Mr. FIALLO as well, because the question is, what is the role of the Secretariat in terms of holding the Security Council accountable? What is the role of the Secretariat here? So, Ms. KHALIL, may I turn to you, please, first?
I want to thank Diana for asking that question. It's a question that is very, very dear to my heart. As Angela noted, I've served with the organization, and albeit now serving from the outside, I do take that question very much to heart. I think much of the world, including many in the Secretariat, have forgotten that the Secretariat is the sixth principal organ, and that the Charter foresees a very independent, not just impartial, but independent role for the Secretary General and for the Secretariat. And that many who serve and who come to serve in the organization come because of that sense of calling, because of that need to give voice to the voiceless. The Secretariat cannot just be the implementer of the mandates of the intergovernmental organizations. That is very much a big component of the role of the Secretariat, but it is also to speak for those who don't have a voice. The governments have a voice. They are at the meetings. They have their and their ability to speak, their ability to make proposals, their ability to vote, and their ability to form decisions and resolutions. However, the voiceless, we the peoples, the charter is written in the name of we the peoples, not we the governments, not we the states. It's we the peoples, and ultimately how well we serve the peoples, the recognized peoples of the world, is our measure of success. And the Secretary General and the Secretariat have to speak for those who are fighting for justice, fighting for criminal accountability, fighting to fight off the impacts of climate change, fighting to end genocide, fighting to end war, and to address the root causes of the conflicts that they're suffering through. These are all part of the UN's architecture. The UN has made huge advances, laudable advances in recognizing the 4 pillars of the global counterterrorism strategy, for instance, the ability to intertwine the political, the military, the good governance, the human rights, the development, the disarmament, the rehabilitation into the peacekeeping mandate. The efforts are there, the resources are being given. What is needed is a fundamental change in attitude, a sense of responsibility. We talk about the primary responsibility of the Security Council, but there is also the responsibility of the General Assembly when the Security Council is prevented from acting. The Uniting for Peace resolution gives the General Assembly the opportunity to step in and do what is right. The preamble of that resolution beautifully talks about the fact that when the Council is prevented because of a veto or a threat of veto, that responsibility doesn't evaporate. We don't just wash our hands and go home. There is a residual authority that the General Assembly, and as Diana has pointed out, also the Secretary General. Article 99 is there because the founders of the organization foresaw a situation where the Council might want to deflect or defer or to ignore or to postpone action, when in fact it is their duty to act promptly and effectively. So when that happens, the Secretary General is not only responsible, but is empowered to bring those matters to the attention of the Council, to hold up a mirror and say, you need to act, and to give concrete recommendations on how action can be achieved, how justice can be achieved, and how law and peace and security and justice can be restored. So that independence, that impartiality, that courage is what is needed and is unfortunately missing.
Thank you. And also thank you for reminding us that the Secretariat is the 6th organ of the United Nations. One forgets that. One really does forget that. Mr. FIALLO, I'll now turn to you.
Thank you. That again is really a very interesting question. We could actually include an additional chapter to our book only to address this specific question, which is very interesting. But I think the answer, in my perspective, is clear. The Secretary General Guterres is doing what he needs to do. I actually see leadership in himself. And an example of it is the global call for ceasefire that he launched in March 2020, but we member states were only able to back up on 4 months later. So I also see the value, because the question was, what is the work of the Secretariat with regard to the Security Council? There's a lot of value in the system, in the procedures. So, for example, in the reports of the Secretary General, the reports that are submitted to the Council, and many other elements. And then I just want to add that in my perspective, not only the Secretariat represent the people, but we member states represent our people. We also represent, and we should represent our people. Obviously, if there is a case where a member state is not representing their people, that is a deficiency of democracy and of what should be done. But I can tell you, for example, I truly believe Ecuador diplomacy, including in the United Nations, is representing our national interest and the people of Ecuador, but also of the world, which is multilateralism, not only for our people, but for every nation to live in peace and in prosperity. I'll conclude on this question, maybe underlining again the specific and very relevant role of academia and civil society that can help and always help both the Secretariat, and member states to connect with each other, but also to go deep in the analysis and in finding solutions.
Thank you very much. I think that's a very important sector that we haven't really talked about. And we now only have a couple of minutes left. We have about 10 minutes left. And I do want to ask you one other question. And that really comes to another challenge that we're facing right now, and that every country, a lot of people are actually trying to implement, and that's the climate change. And I remember that when COVID started, and it was a couple of weeks into COVID, all of a sudden there were like these huge drops in the airplane flights and, tourism, et cetera, et cetera. But on the other hand, it did reduce the footprint, the carbon footprint that we all had and that we all had gotten used to. And so now I'm asking the question, can the deep disruption, which is caused by the pandemic, move us to make the necessary changes, the institutional changes, maybe also the personal changes, and make the right policy choices, including putting the economies on a path towards a fairer, and I'm mentioning that particularly, and a greener choice. So I'll give the floor to Ms. KHALIL and afterwards to Mr. FIALLO. And if you want to add some concluding comments, please do so now.
Yes, indeed. I mean, I think there are two possible trajectories on the climate change issues. We have seen the youth of the world take the lead here as the primary victims of the insanity that has been the last 20 years. We had plenty of warning of the acceleration of the climate change crisis. We have largely ignored those warning signs. And we find ourselves at an almost existential moment, a last chance to turn things around. The Paris Agreement was meant to be the hope, and in large part was recognized as being the smallest possible measure, and yet for some was too many. And we saw that the US walked away from that agreement and is now walking back into the agreement, and in a sense, reviving the hope that everybody, and again, it can't just be one country, it has to be everybody, especially those with the largest contribution to the footprint, the Chinese and the Americans, and to a lesser degree, the EU, who have to take the bulk of the action. So we have that, again, wake-up call that hopefully can send us in the right direction. The fear, however, is that as soon as this pandemic is over, and it's not like we've done really well under the pandemic, because while in some domains, we have reduced the footprint, but in totality, the difference has been marginal. And we have the accelerated melting of the ice caps. We have a forecast that actually once this pandemic is over, people are going to go crazy. The travel is going to be crazy. The indulgence is going to be crazy. And in a sense, as human beings, we need that. We need to flex our social muscles. We need to revisit each other, revisit each other's countries, revisit our families across the globe. So a part of that is almost human nature. We need to restore the social animal in all of us that we have kind of put at bay for the last year and a half. But that is going to mean a tremendous resurgence of flights and return to the normal fossil fuel kind of driven activities of humankind. So we're going to have these two things happening in parallel. So without a concerted effort on the part of governments, but also local leaders and local communities, and we as individuals, we can all do better in terms of our recycling, in terms of reducing the plastic patch that's growing in the ocean. It's not just about a decade for action as a philosophical rallying cry. It's an existential rallying cry. Our future generations will not have a future if the planet is not protected. And we don't, we have the strong voices of the Greta Thunbergs of the world, but it's every child and every descendant of our generation that is owed that. Our behavior will impact whether they have a future or not. So let me just step up for 1 or 2 minutes. The ultimate irony, as seems to be the thread here, is while we've been forced to stay apart on an individual level, the answer to all of our problems, whether it's pandemic or climate change or anything else, is coming together, is restoring the belief in not just the desirability, but the efficacy of multilateralism. Not just restoring and resurrecting our faith in those universal values that we learned so hard as a result of the Holocaust and World War II, but believing in the efficacy of those values, that they will save us, not as a matter of good ideals or good Samaritanism, but as a recipe for survival, as a recipe to rise above the chaos and cynicism that has brought destruction before and can and will bring destruction again. So we need to recommit ourselves to the Charter, recommit ourselves to the Declaration of Human Rights. And I was very, very relieved to see member states do that so vocally and so concretely and unapologetically, unequivocally in the 75 Declaration. But still, that's words. We need to see that in action. We need that same commitment to be played out in action. We need the Council to recognize that veto does not belong when mass atrocity crimes are at stake. And mass atrocities don't only happen, as we have learned, as a result of war and genocide and terrorism, but also because of pandemics and climate change. So whenever mass atrocities are at stake, we need to set aside our narrow national interests and work together for the common advancement of humanity, the common recognition of the dignity and respect of the human being. The General Assembly has to step up. The Secretary General has to step up. I agree with Andres that the Secretary General's call for the global ceasefire was a sign of proactivity that we hadn't heretofore seen from the Secretary General. And when he acted, they followed. And that should be a recipe for greater proactivity. It cannot be a one-off. So when he led, they followed. The Security Council eventually endorsed the idea. The General Assembly did so almost immediately. So there is room for leadership by the Secretariat, and we look forward to more of that.
Thank you very much. That was a very strong appeal and also a reminder of what is needed after we've gone through this year and will still be going through for at least the foreseeable couple of months, whatever it's going to be. So that's very, very, very important. Mr. FIALLO, I turn to you now, please.
Thank you again. And really, I've enjoyed this discussion this morning and this afternoon for you in Vienna. The answer to your question is yes. SDGs as the roadmap for recovery. There is opportunity. Among other, I like to mention the President Biden summit. And there are opportunities for green investment. And also it's important that we remind that COVID-19 is a pandemic that apparently is coming due to also the abuse to the nature, the overexploitation of nature. So we need to go towards more greener economies and societies. To wrap up, I will wrap up very quickly with one quote attributed to Montesquieu, and I think it works very perfect for multilateralism. And this is the only future I see that will bring us to prosperity and to respect for human rights and to strengthening of the United Nations, of the international community and every people of the world. And if you allow me, I'll read it. If I knew of something that could serve my nation but will ruin another, I will not propose it to my prince, for I am first a man and only then a Frenchman, because I am necessarily a man and only accidentally I am French. If I knew something useful to my country and harmful to Europe, or useful to Europe and harmful to mankind, I will look it upon as a crime. I wanted to conclude with this. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. FIALLO. That's very, very touching and very foresighted, I must say, of Mr. Montesquieu. I must say that it's been a really fascinating discussion. I found that too, and talking to very knowledgeable diplomats, one on the UN side, the other one on the national side, on the Ecuadorian side. And I look forward to the book, actually, when it comes out in 2 weeks' time, The Future of Diplomacy After COVID-19. I'm very happy that the International Institute for Peace, together with the Peter Ustinov Institute, could host this webinar. And I look forward to seeing you on another occasion. And I hope all of us will, the people who are watching, as well as all of us here, will come through this COVID without any further sickness, disease, and may you and your families stay well, and goodbye.